What's up guys, and welcome back to another episode on this channel. In this one we're gonna do a lot of work to the Volvo 740. I've got a bunch of parts here that we're gonna change out, so it's gonna be a real wrench fest. I'm gonna be changing out the entire PCV system, and maybe I'll have to replace the intake manifold gaskets when I do that, I don't know. Gonna replace spark plugs, engine mounts, transmission mounts, a couple of bushings in the rear because I've noticed a lot of side-to-side movement. I'm also going to be replacing the rear shocks so that I have new suspension components all around in our four corners, and as well as some brake hoses in the rear. But before we're going to go ahead and do all that, when I did my annual rust proofing with some fluid film around the car or the under area, I started to poke around in this spare wheel area right here that I've just been ignoring for the time that I've owned the car, because I have seen a lot of like rust bubbles starting to form underneath the coating, the undercoating. So I started to poke around a little bit and scraped off the loose rust, and what do you know, I've got some rust holes. So I'll probably just cut out this area right here where it has rusted through and replace it with some new metal. So let's go ahead and do that real quickly, and then we can start with the other work. So I patched that area up really quick, so now we can finally move on to the fun stuff. So first of all, I'm going to replace a broken fuel hose, and for those of you who remember the very first episode of this Volvo 740, this is the same hose that I've replaced, and now already 2 years later it's cracked again, so probably it was a very low quality hose that I replaced it with. So I bought some quality fuel hose from Line, so hopefully this will last me many years to come. Next up, I'm gonna be replacing the rear shocks on this car, and for that I obviously need to remove the wheels. Replacing the rear shock absorbers on this car is really simple. There's just one bolt at the bottom and one bolt at the top behind this plastic cover. Being a 34-year-old car that's been living in Sweden its entire life, most of the fasteners are really rusty, so penetrating fluid and a wire brush is your best friend in this situation. Yeah, it's safe to say these shock absorbers are completely shot. Remember to always prime new shock absorbers a couple of times before fitting them to the car. A good tip here is to refit that plastic strap for much easier installation. Next up is to do these old brake hoses. I already replaced the ones in the front not too long ago, so we got brand new brake hoses there. So let's go ahead and do these ones.
Before I even try to remove the brake hose, it's really important to make sure that you can in fact loosen up the bleed nipple, because every time you open up the brake hydraulics, it's really important to bleed the system afterwards. Yeah, that wasn't even close to coming off, so no time to waste. Let's just cut the brake hose off and get a socket on, and then we can also try to heat it up. But even after all of that, it was still very seized to the threads.
So I finally managed to get the old brake hose off, or what was remaining of it. But unfortunately, this fitting right here is rounded off. Luckily, the pipe is in okay condition. It didn't get kinked or twisted too much, so it's definitely reusable. The question is how we're gonna replace this fitting right here, because I could just cut this flare off. That's probably just 3 millimeters or something, and then create a new flare. But then I would have to do it on the car, and I don't have the right tool to do it on the car. So either I will have to buy the correct tool, or I will have to disconnect the entire brake pipe going all the way to the front of the car and doing it on the bench, because I have a proper tool for creating new brake pipes. But you have to use that tool in a vise. So let me think, and I will come back with a solution.
So what I ended up doing was buying a tool that enables me to create brake flares while still on the car. Make sure no debris has fallen into the hole on the brake caliper. Luckily, the brake hose on the other side was much easier to remove. Then of course it's time to bleed the system and refill it with some fresh new brake fluid.
So everything is tightened up and bled on both sides, so now is the moment of truth. We're gonna do a leak test. So I'm gonna try to press the brake pedal as hard as I can, and it feels nice and firm, which is a good sign. I'm gonna do it with the engine on as well, but I'm starting with the engine off and seeing if there's any leaks. And everything looks bone dry there. Everything looks dry on that connection. Let's go ahead and check on the other side. Everything is dry there, and everything is dry there. And usually, if you can't find any leaks whatsoever with the engine off and you're pressing down the brake pedal, it won't leak when the engine is on as well. But it's just a good habit to turn on the engine, because you get higher brake pressure when the engine is on, so that's something you should do as well. But I'll let you know if it leaks with the engine on as well. So with the engine on and pressing the brake pedal as hard as I can, we still have no leaks, which is very good news, because I was a bit worried with this connection actually right here, because the flare wasn't so pretty, if I'm gonna be honest, but it's completely leak free, which is great news, of course. So let's move on with this project. Now, while we are still here in the rear end of the car, let's go ahead and disassemble this rod right here to replace these probably very worn out bushings. There's one right here and one over there. Now, this bolt goes straight into the body of the car, so you can actually have a visual on the threads. If you take a look in the luggage compartment, if you lift the carpet, you can actually see the bolt going through there. I've already checked it, and the threads look completely rust-free, so we should be good to go right there. And I've been soaking this one in penetrating fluid for the last 24 hours and brushing away the rust on the threads from this side. So yeah, let's just see how it will go.
Actually, the threads weren't exposed on the other side, that's why they are in such a good condition. With some scraping and a lot of work with the wire wheel, I got rid of the rust. The inner portions of the bushings are the easy part to remove. The hard part is the outer race, so what I ended up doing is cutting a slot in the outer race carefully, and then it's really easy to hammer them out.
As we can see, I didn't get the bushings in all of the way. It was just too much resistance for the vise. I tried with a threaded rod also, but yeah, it was just too much resistance to get it all the way in. So I finally invested in a hydraulic press, well worth investment in the future. If I'm gonna do any of these bushings again or wheel bearings, it's going to be a breeze to install that in the future. So let's unpack it, assemble everything, and place it somewhere here in the workshop. I'm thinking over there is probably a good spot if I just remove the wheels and everything that's in the way. So yeah, let's get right to it.
After 2 coats of black hammerlack, it's ready to go back on the car. Next up is a basic service to the fuel system. As we can see, everything is very rusty, so I actually struggled with this for a while, and that's also why I didn't film everything in much detail. But in short, I needed to remove 2 fuel fittings and the clamp holding on the fuel filter itself, and then I just cut off that fuel pipe so I don't need to tackle that very rusty banjo bolt. It wouldn't surprise me if this is the original fuel filter that came with the car. Moving along, it's time to replace the transmission and motor mounts. In order to remove the transmission mount, you need to also remove the transmission crossmember, which is only held on with 4 bolts. But before you go ahead and remove it, make sure to support the transmission with a jack underneath.
So we have a small problem right here. The new transmission mounts, the threads on the studs right here, they are fine threads, M10 by I think 1.25 or something like that. Anyways, they are fine threads, and the original mount, they are just normal M10 threads. So the old nuts won't fit on to the new part, and they did not include new nuts with it. And I don't have any spare M10 fine threads just laying around. I only have normal threads right here in the workshop. So, Professional Parts Sweden, please take a note of this and send the correct nuts with the motor mount, or the transmission mount, sorry. 3 days later, and I finally got the correct nuts, so let's go ahead and mount this on the car. Houston, we have another problem. As we can see, I had to cut up a portion of this stud right here, because this one was very much longer than the original one, so the stud was actually hitting the transmission itself. It wouldn't go on. So yeah, I needed to cut off about 6 millimeters of this stud right here. So now it will hopefully fit.
Next up is the motor mounts, one on each side, but before you go ahead and remove the fasteners, you need to support and lift the engine somehow.
There we go, I'm done with the motor mounts on both sides, and I can actually tell that the engine sits noticeably more higher up in the air. I mean, higher center of gravity, but I mean, they were pretty worn out, so they had to go. So it feels nice to have new, fresh motor mounts in there. So we got a couple of more things to do here in the engine bay. I'm gonna change out the entire PCV system. Gonna replace the spark plugs, and if we have time in this video, I'm gonna go ahead and change out the thermostat along with the housing and a new hose, because I have noticed that it's leaking a little tiny bit. You can't see it now, probably because it's hot, but if it's cold and it's been sitting for a couple of days, you might see a drop or two of coolant. So as I said, if I still have time for it on this video, I will go ahead and replace that. But first of all, let's begin with the PCV system.
It's really important to clean around the intake ports so that any junk won't fall into the engine when you remove the intake manifold.
So I have disconnected everything that I can see, so I think we should be free to remove the intake manifold now. So here we go.
The manifold was actually really stubborn to remove because the stud closest to the front of the engine was seized to the manifold itself. But after a lot of wiggling and elbow grease, I finally managed to get it off. If there's any red block expert out there, can someone please tell me, is this head original or are the intake ports slightly ported? Or are they just supposed to be looking like this from the factory?
Anyways, now we can see the PCV system, and as we can see, it's much easier to get to now with the intake off. It didn't take very long at all anyways, so I really recommend to take off the intake manifold. But yeah, let's go ahead and remove this. It's just 2 bolts down there, and replace it with a new one.
While I was in here, I took the opportunity to remove and clean the idle control valve.
Now, while I got the intake out, this is the perfect opportunity to replace a thermostat, and I've also ordered a thermostat housing because this one is very corroded and old. Also, I'm going to be replacing this upper radiator hose, so let's go ahead and replace this while we're in here. So a 5-minute job turned into something absolutely massive. The thermostat housing is completely welded to this stud right here. I tried to remove the stud, but with no luck, the stud snapped. And I've tried everything. I've tried heating it a lot and banging on it and all kinds of methods, and it just won't come out. When I try to spin the whole thermostat housing, it actually spins with the stud, but the stud is completely stuck to the housing. So I'm gonna have to try to figure something out, and I need to get this off.
What I ultimately had to do was, with a chisel and a hammer, break off the ear of the housing, and that was the only way to get it off. Unfortunately, after cleaning the sealing surface on the head, it was pretty pitted from all of the corrosion, so I had to use some RTV there. That's nothing I would want to use, but in this case I pretty much have to if I wanted to seal. And yes, I forgot to put on the lifting brackets, but as we're gonna see later on in the video, I realized this and put it back on.
Okay, so the fitment is actually really bad on this new hose that I bought. If I try to fit it on the radiator right here, I have a kink in the middle of the hose, which obviously is not good. But it seems to be, if I just cut it a little bit, it will fit a lot better. So I'll try to cut it and we'll see where we end up. So there we go, a lot better when I shorten the hose a little bit. And of course I'm using new stainless steel hose clamps. So let's move on with reinstalling the intake.
Now the spark plugs that were in there were relatively new and in good condition, but I still wanted a good brand spark plugs in my engine.
So everything is finally buttoned up. Just gonna refill it with some fresh new coolant, get rid of all of the tools in the engine bay, and then go out for a test drive. So there we go, the test drive went really well. It honestly just felt like it did before pretty much, except for the new motor and transmission mounts. I could really tell a difference there. The new rubber is a bit stiffer than the original were. The original were pretty worn out too as well, so yeah, you could definitely tell that the car was a bit firmer on the road. And until next time, the next time the Volvo appears on the channel again, I will probably go ahead and change out the entire exhaust system, because it has a bunch of small leaks in it, so it's really just best to replace the entire thing. However, I haven't decided if I'm gonna go with a custom one, if I'm gonna build me a custom one, or just replace it with an OE style exhaust. So I'll have to decide on that, but until next time, have a really good one, guys. See you then. Bye.